So on the 27th of June this year at about 10 o'clock UK time, the world changed for several big global organisations. Suddenly, they couldn't work. They couldn't do anything. They were essentially collateral damage associated with nation-state conflict, and malware called NotPetya got into their networks and at machine speed worked its way through Active Directory until it got to the top of Active Directory, the domain admin, copied itself everywhere, and essentially rendered every Windows machine that was turned on at that time unusable. Phenomenal devastation. And if anyone here has worked with companies that were impacted by that, and several of them have been very public on the impact of them, people like Maersk and Reckitt Benckiser and others, it was devastating. It was just phenomenal. And a whole load of traditional security controls that we think are keeping us safe actually were irrelevant. There were no missing patches exploited. There's nothing to do with WannaCry, as some people said. If you imagine all the security operations center, in the time it would take for an analyst to open an alert and see what was going on and work out what had happening, it was already scorched earth globally. It was phenomenal. Automation, no command traffic to intercept and realize there was something funny going on. It was all automated. And going back to the comment that was made by Peter from the National Cybersecurity Center earlier about the sort of the preconditioning that had gone on, this actually, it turns out, went back to a backdoor that was introduced through a software supply chain in April by Russia. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, the sort of the force and devastation of the attack. And actually the world changed for many organizations. And the fact is that we live in a very different world than we did 5 years ago. We all talk about this interconnected world and everything, but actually it's just gone to a degree that none of us could ever dream of. And we're still waking up to the realities of what this means for us as organizations, society, and individuals. And the fact is, in this world, we all need to change. Governments need to change, society needs to change, and it was great hearing the Minister talk about some of the things that this government is pushing in that way. Individuals need to change, and there's going to need to be some real change in behaviours about how we use digital technology. But what I'm going to talk about is organisations, companies, corporates, public sector organisations, what we need to change in order to think differently in this new world. Because the old ways of thinking, actually, the sort of controls mindset of we can just take what we've got and layer controls on top and that will make us secure, actually that needs to change. We actually need to think about how we can change the way we work to be securable, not try and secure what we've got. So I'm just going to talk through a few areas that I think really need to change. I'm sure there's some more that I haven't thought of, and then just talk about some things that I think boards could do to really start to get to grips with this and start to make a difference. So the areas that I think really need to change, the colours have changed on this. So sort of going around from the top, the first one, resilient business. The key area for all organisations is to realise that the challenge for security is not securing your kit, it's securing your processes and securing the data that goes through those processes. And a whole load of thinking around how we do security is actually focused on securing your kit. And in this interconnected world where our data and processes are going all over the place, we've lost control of the kit that we're relying on. So now we've got to think about the processes. And this was a kind of stark reality for the banks, where I worked back in 10 years ago when online banking fraud really started to take off. And we suddenly realized all our attention for online banking was securing the servers and the bank side of the transaction. The fraudsters said, well, there's two sides to every transaction, we'll just target the other end. And so they just took loads of £1,000 out of bank accounts, and that's where sort of online banking fraud came from. But a complete shift in mindset. So for banks, we had to change our thinking to say, how can you secure the process even when the kit's been compromised? Totally different kind of mindset. And that's where you ended up putting your chip and PIN card into calculators and typing in numbers and things like that, because what you're doing is you're creating transaction authorization that's independent of the kit. So if the kit's been compromised, the process is still resilient. So this concept of resilient business, resilient processes is so important. And it brings a different mindset around use of cloud technologies and things like that. So a lot of regulators are still in the place where use of cloud is bad. You can't trust it because you've lost control of the kit. Well, try saying that to any of the victims of NotPetya. because it was cloud processes that actually saved them, or if they'd had it, would have saved them in terms of their recovery, because it wasn't their kit that was that their processes were relying on. Second one around authenticating people. We do a lot of breach response, incident response, crisis work all around the world, and I think the one thing that I will say is every single successful attack that's had a huge impact that I've ever seen has involved exploiting the use of static credentials, passwords, somewhere along the line. We have to get beyond passwords. And there's a whole load of exciting technology and different ways of thinking and doing things out there, but we as organizations need to embrace them and change the way we work, because it's the one thing that just consistently, time and time again, gets exploited. Validating inputs. I think this is a really interesting one, and there's a conversation later about fake news. I think one of the biggest mindsets that attackers have in cybersecurity that defenders don't have is one of the sort of biggest differences is attackers don't always target the system that they're concerned about. They target the inputs. If I can corrupt the inputs, I can corrupt the system. And a great example is if you want to influence an election. You don't have to actually attack the casting of votes. If you can attack the data on which those decisions are made, i.e. the news, and corrupt that, then you can change the outcome and you can change the system. And you see it time and time again. The same kind of concept with online banking. This concept that attackers have, if I can corrupt the inputs, I can corrupt the outcome. Protecting data. Again, another kind of mindset change we need to go through. All of our technologies historically around protecting data have been tied to the system that the data sits on. But my data is going everywhere. It's going out to cloud providers and all over the place. And there's a sort of a new wave of thinking coming to market around how you can protect data when you've lost control of the systems that it's on, sort of data-centric encryption. And it's really powerful. So when data leaves my control, I can still control who accesses it, even when it's on a cloud service or somewhere else. So there's a huge sort of shift required there. And then I think probably the hardest one is fixing what I call the hard basics. So NotPetya was a great example. It exploited not missing security controls. It exploited the fact that every organization globally has built itself in a way where they didn't kind of architect themselves for security from the first place. And especially around things like Active Directory, domain name service, DNS kind of technologies, it's all kind of proliferated in a kind of out of control way. And that's what attackers are beginning to target more and more. And it's a really hard one if you're inside an organization to justify fixing, because there's no obvious immediate business benefit for tidying up Active Directory and investing huge amounts of money rebuilding Active Directory so it's clean. But actually, that's what attackers are targeting. So these sort of fixing the hard basics is going to become more and more of an issue, and more of sort of an investment challenge for organizations. Anomaly detection, going back to that NotPetya example as well, which is so useful in many ways. What's really interesting is the attacker was working at machine speed. So all of our kind of security monitoring detection processes that rely on humans interacting with technology and processes and verifying things, suddenly they're not quite so good. So the ability to react at machine time, the ability to detect events and close them down quickly is going to become increasingly important. And also I think the ability to look across people, process and technology at the same time in sort of a holistic approach to monitoring. So monitoring for my machine behaving badly is one thing, but monitoring for my machine behaving badly when I've logged on and I've accessed an application that I don't normally access and I'm not in the office and I'm meant to be on holiday, that's a whole different story, and that gives you a different picture, and that kind of people, process, technology view is going to be really important. Culture is absolutely critical. Many attacks exploit the fact that either at the time of the attack or in terms of how businesses were built, how processes were built, people aren't thinking about security in everything they do. And the ability to empower every individual in the organization to secure your organization is absolutely critical. And it starts with the board. And then third-party oversight. We've seen a lot the last few days around Equifax being breached. They are a third party, essentially, to a huge number of organizations around the world. Huge number of organizations have trusted your data and my data to that organization. And the ability to gain real oversight of your supply chain and the people you rely on for your processes globally is going to become really critical, and turning it from a kind of an audit mentality into an operational mentality where you can really see the risk through your supply chain in real time is going to, I think, be one of the big challenges of the coming years. And then finally, untrusted apps around the edge. We're seeing more and more use of cloud technologies, people essentially losing control of their application development, DevOps and things like that. Organizations have outsourced application development to all sorts of places around the world, and you have very little control actually over what's happening in the applications. And again, going back to NotPetya, the attack vector was to compromise the software provider to a whole load of companies and put the malicious code in there. So the whole area of apps, which we all trust instinctively, that's going to be a huge challenge for many organizations. And this all comes down to a change in risk mindset. Organizations need to change their mindset from kind of layering security controls on what they've got and thinking about how do I change the way we work? How do we change our businesses to be securable in today's world? So I'm just going to end with just a few thoughts on sort of how you actually make that a reality with a board. We do a lot of work with boards, and both in times of sort of normal times when they're building defenses and also post-incident when you're sort of helping them understand what's gone on. And I think there are sort of 7 things that boards need to consider, and investors too. There's much more on our website. You can download a paper on it. But it's sort of just 7 kind of simple principles that you can adopt at a board. One is have a real understanding of exposure. I think it was a gentleman down here in the question earlier was kind of alluding to this, that many boards just don't realize how exposed they are. And I would say the one thing that's common when we talk with boards after a breach, the one reaction that is totally common apart from kind of the emotion of it is just didn't realize we were that vulnerable, didn't realize we had that exposure. And so that kind of first point around a real understanding of exposure is what everything else hangs off. Then having this holistic framework and approach that goes beyond standards, goes beyond sort of traditional controls thinking, and thinks about what are these big problems that we need to fix in terms of the way we work as a business to move us to a future we can be confident in. Having capability and resource, we've had a lot of talk about that, both skills throughout the organization, but also at the board level, who can really understand what's going on. Having independent review and test. So the Bank of England launched a couple of years ago in the UK something called CBEST, which was essentially requiring every big FS institution to submit themselves to a sort of an ethical hacker regime where they would be attacked as an attacker would. And it was a huge wake-up call for the whole industry. And the Bank of England said it was a huge wake-up call for them themselves. Finally, number 5, incident response. Being prepared for incidents, being prepared for the worst case incidents, and thinking as a business beyond the technical response, but actually how would we respond to some of these big incidents that we would never have dreamed of previously, but the kind of Equifax and the NotPetya kind of incidents where they are huge business shocks, and being able to deal with that as a business. Working together as a community, we see loads of examples where attackers, again, they work through attacking a community rather than attacking an individual organization. We think of ourselves as separate organizations. The attackers see us as just business processes that span a whole load of different organizations, and they want to exploit the process. They don't want to exploit an individual organization. And then finally, a kind of considered approach to the legal and regulatory environments. There's a huge complexity evolving globally with data protection, sort of cybersecurity regulation, in different industries that just creates a hugely complex legal and regulatory environment. And actually, pure compliance is probably not achievable in that many of the regulations are actually being outpaced by the digital technologies. So simple things like password complexity, you can find all sorts of regulations on a global bank that are conflicting and kind of bizarre when you think about the risk management side of it. So having that considered approach to know what you want to achieve, how you manage your risk, and actually how you deal with some of the inconsistencies in these global environments is really important. So a very quick canter through some of the things that I think need to change, some of the things that boards and executive management can do to manage that change. And in summary, I would just say the game has changed, and we need to change our game with it. Thank you. And I think I've got time for, a few questions. you can have an early break. Yeah, Kristen.
So was your question as a comment? Point I was going to make in the previous session. Sorry. Yeah. John Carr from the Children's Charities Coalition on Internet Safety. The notion of permissionless innovation is deeply sort of ingrained in the kind of whole culture and traditions of the internet, and that's resulted, for example, in toys being manufactured, some by fly-by-night companies in small remote countries, others, however, by more substantial companies that nevertheless connected to the internet. I don't know exactly how many might have formed part of the Mirai botnet, but I'm pretty sure they would have been in there. And for all that we can regulate and we can get the big companies in the city and so on to do the right thing, how do we manage a situation where it is still possible for anybody anywhere in the world to connect a physical device somewhere to the network, which in the end endangers all of us, without there being some kind of intermediary mechanisms that validate and authenticate the devices themselves?
Yeah.
I mean, we heard about the unpatchable, stuff that's already there. More of it could still be coming.
Absolutely, and I think especially in the consumer space and with children as well, I think there is a strong argument for need of some government intervention in terms of kite marks or something like that, where the paint on my children's toys has to be manufactured to a certain standard and has a kite mark with it. And I think there's a real, you could say there's a real case for that kind of approach to consumer products. I mean, we've done some, one of our research team has found some vulnerabilities in a consumer product that's in many homes in the UK. The manufacturer is out in China. We notified the manufacturer. We've notified them 4 times, no response. And we're now kind of saying, well, what do we do? Because actually this vulnerability doesn't just make that product vulnerable, but it also enables an attacker to get hold of the whole Wi-Fi in that organization. So suddenly this product has made the whole home vulnerable. And actually, what do you do with that? So we're kind of going through the various places we could report it to sort of say, well, actually, what's the responsible thing to do with that vulnerability if the manufacturer is not responding? So great example. Russell.
So Russell Howard from Nominet. I'm just curious, when we talk about the FTSE 350 and the scarcity of skills of cybersecurity and also the number of vectors of potential attacks, when you go down that chain and start to think about medium-sized organizations, clearly they're more vulnerable. So how does one start to think about the opportunities to work with boards, but also given the number of vectors of attack, you can never be safe in many ways. So what's the roadmap, do you think, to keep medium-sized businesses as well as the larger businesses safe online?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think a big part of it is thinking in terms of resilient processes rather than resilient kit. So many medium-sized organizations have realized that they don't have the means and the wherewithal to secure online credit card payments. So they outsource that to a cloud provider. Now that's a very sensible thing because you've outsourced a whole load of challenges that you would require a whole load of skills that you wouldn't be able to acquire to deal with to a third party that should, in theory, be able to invest at scale and produce the skills that are required to secure that. So I think a big part of it is thinking about the processes. And within those processes, what are we going to be good at? And actually, what should we be looking to others to fulfill? And using cloud services in a more and more intelligent way to kind of create those resilient processes and not just sort of assume that you have to secure everything yourself. Mark, is it?
Thank you. Mark Wood from Nominet. Richard, can you just say a little bit more about where the threat's coming from? Is it, increasingly more sophisticated homegrown criminals, or is it increasingly more sophisticated Russians and and state-backed players from other countries? Or how is the mix, and is it changing?
I think my impression, and I think different people would have different views, my impression is that the mix isn't necessarily changing, it's just everything's growing. And yeah, the staggering thing for anyone who's sort of spent time looking into the threat side of this space is that it's not individual actors you face, it's actually a marketplace. The way online banking fraud happens is just phenomenal as an example, where it is a supply chain, it's a marketplace. One person will produce some code that attacks online banking for a specific bank. Another person will produce some code that enables you to take control of people's machines when they click on a link or open an attachment. The person who produced that will sell it on a criminal forum. Another organization will be brilliant at sending out the spam emails and convincing people to click on the link or open the attachment. They'll send that out to 1 million people. They'll get 10,000 hits. They'll then sell 10,000 compromised machines to someone else, who will then use that and combine that with, or they'll probably review it and work out how many of those machines are clients of Bank X. They'll then buy the code to subvert the online banking transactions for Bank X. And then they'll have, out of that 10,000, they'll have 500 compromised customers of Bank X where they've got control of their accounts. They'll sell that to someone else who'll then move money out of it. They'll then sell the money laundering accounts to someone else who'll take the money out of the country. It is a supply chain. And in there, you've got nation states who might be really sophisticated, but actually if you are really sophisticated and all you've got to do is buy access from a criminal forum, then why wouldn't you? And not use your really sophisticated tools. So it is a complete kind of mess of a marketplace. And that evolution is happening faster and faster, I think. Sorry, lady.
Louise Bennett, BCS. I'd like to follow up on what John Carr was asking you. I've been thinking very hard about small businesses and how they can get access to cybersecurity. And one of the suppliers that many small businesses have are payroll suppliers, because they trust them to do a very complicated, secure thing. Do you think there's any way that payroll suppliers can expand their business to help small businesses do things online in a safe fashion?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunity in that space, and in some ways, for small businesses and consumers, there's a real opportunity for sort of trusted brands to develop, where I trust them because they're secure as much as what they do, and that could easily evolve out of the payroll side of the business into more and more sort of invoicing, and you can imagine a natural evolution path. So I think absolutely there's an opportunity there.